I pressed the ram horn against my chest on the night the snowstorm howled louder than wolves and the fire sank to a bed of fading coals. It had been years since my husband was taken from me by the mountain, yet even now I could not let the horn out of my hands. The avalanche that buried him left no body to mourn, no grave to kneel beside, no last words to cling to. All that was returned to me was this horn, curved and ridged, still carrying the marks of his fingers where he had polished it with use. When others looked at it, they saw only the tool of a shepherd, a simple relic of a man who worked the hills with his flock. But when I looked at it, I felt the pulse of memory beneath the bone, as though some part of him remained sealed within it, waiting for me to hold it close and remember that once I was not alone. In those early days, I told myself the horn was nothing more than an object, yet I carried it to the doorway at dusk and stood in the bitter wind, listening to the hills he once crossed. The silence that followed me back inside was heavier than hunger, heavier even than the snow that buried the roof each year. The world had once been filled with sound, his steady whistle calling the flock, the bells chiming on woolly necks, the bleating rising like a hymn over the valley. When he was gone, that sound was stolen, and what remained was a silence that did not simply fall over the land but crawled inside me, filling every chamber of my heart. It was this silence, more than cold or emptiness, that hollowed me into the shape of a widow. The people of the valley said I was mad to keep the horn. They told me to bury it with a prayer and walk into a new life. Yet I could not. To them, it was a keepsake, a bone carved into a vessel for breath. To me it was a presence, heavier than it should have been, charged with something unseen. When I touched it, I felt more than memory. I felt the impression of a promise. At night I laid it beside me, its curve fitting the hollow of my body. And in sleep I clutched it so tightly that I often woke with purple bruises pressed into my skin. The more I held it, the more it seemed to hold me in return, as if the horn itself refused to be abandoned. Seasons passed, and the horn became the rhythm of my survival. Through 7 winters I guarded it. Each winter brought thinner food, colder nights, neighbors who whispered that I had withered into a ghost among them. I ate less, spoke less, and lived more in memory than in flesh. Yet the horn remained a constant, its ridges polished smooth by the passing of my fingers. Sometimes, when the wind pressed through the chimney and set the cabin trembling, I swore I could hear a resonance rise from the horn itself. It was not music, not even a note, but a deep vibration that lived in the bone, as if something within it was waiting to be spoken aloud. I began to believe that if I endured long enough, it would reveal its message. By the 2nd winter, I had grown so attached that I carried it even to my bed, whispering prayers into it as if it were an ear that could listen. By the 3rd, I began to wonder if the prayers that filled its hollow were swelling into something that might one day be released. By the 4th, I withdrew from company altogether, preferring the horn's quiet companionship to the pitying looks of those who pitied my stubborn devotion. By the 5th, I began to doubt my own name, for it was never spoken by another voice in my home. Yet one night, I thought I heard hoofbeats in the distance. My heart leapt, and I clutched the horn tighter. But when I opened the door, nothing was there, only the groan of frozen trees bending in the wind. That was the first time I mistook silence for arrival. In the 6th winter, I noticed shadows moving outside the cabin and strange prints left near the creek. They were not the hooves of my flock, nor the marks of deer. They were too deliberate, too heavy. I told myself they must be strays wandering, close, though in truth I felt the press of a presence circling, watching, waiting. Yet no one ever came to the door. My life remained trapped between fire, snow, and horn. When the seventh winter arrived, I was scarcely more than bone wrapped in threadbare skin. My hands trembled, my breath fogged in the cabin even with the fire burning, and yet still I clutched the horn. Outside, the creek froze so solid that foxes crossed it like a road, and snow climbed high enough to shutter my windows. And then, on a night colder than any I could remember, I heard hoofbeats again. This time they were not distant. They were deliberate, measured, and they drew closer with each moment. I rose from my bed and pressed my bare feet to the frozen boards. The horn was already in my grasp, as though it had woken me before the sound did. I crept to the door, pressing my ear against the wood. The horse moved slowly, as though its rider wanted me to hear each step. There was no hurry, no disguise, only the surety of arrival. When I opened the door, the night outside was black glass, stars etched sharp against the frozen sky. The creek glowed silver with the shine of the moon, and upon it moved a rider. He sat tall upon a dark horse, his shoulders draped in a heavy cloak, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. The animal's hooves struck the ice like iron hammers, and each sound traveled through the creek bed and into my bones. I should have turned away, should have barred the door, should have whispered a prayer against strangers appearing in the dead of winter. But I could not move. I could only clutch the horn to my chest, for I knew with a strange certainty that this man had not come for me, but for it. The rider reached the bank and turned his shadowed face toward me. He looked not at my body, not at my cabin, but at the horn I held so tightly in my hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but it carried the weight of a bell tolling in the fog. Said, "It waited the whole way. 7 winters I had held the horn in silence. 7 winters I had begged it to speak, and now, in the mouth of a stranger, it had. I could not move. I could not speak. I only held the horn tighter, as if the words he had spoken would slip away if I loosened my grip. In that moment, I understood only one thing with a clarity I had not felt in years. The story of my waiting had ended, and the story of the horn was only beginning. The rider remained there, still as stone, his horse steaming in the moonlight, and I, with the horn pressed to my chest, knew that if I let him take one step closer, my life would never again belong to silence. Each winter I counted was not a year but a punishment, as though time itself had grown crueler with his absence. The first snows fell heavier when there was no one to share the burden of chopping wood, no one to seal the cracks in the roof, no one to speak across the table when the dark pressed in from every corner. My neighbors came at first, offering food and pitying glances, but pity dries faster than firewood, and soon I was left with only silence for company. They whispered of me in the valley that the shepherd's widow had gone half mad, that she clung to the ram horn like it was a child or an idol, that she was wasting away in grief. Yet even their whispers did not wound me as much as the emptiness of my home when the nights stretched longer than the days. Firewood ran out more quickly each year. I learned to burn furniture, scraps of fence, and even pieces of old tools. My hands grew calloused, blistered, cracked from work that was never enough. Hunger gnawed at me, but it was loneliness that carved deeper. There is a weight in the silence of winter when no voice calls your name, when no footsteps stir the snow outside your door. That silence became the rhythm of my existence, and always, I held the ram horn close. It was not only an object to me, it was an anchor. Its ridges grew polished beneath my fingertips, shining like river stones from the hours I spent tracing them. In the horn I poured my prayers, not aloud but through touch, as though my skin could transfer memory into the bone. Each time I pressed it against my chest, I convinced myself I was pressing against him, against the life we once shared. Without the horn, I would have floated away into madness, untethered and weightless. With it, I felt bound to something larger than myself, though I could not yet name what it was. The winters stripped me bare of every comfort except that horn. I became a woman of routines, waking to scrape frost from inside the window, trudging to the woodpile, returning to sit with the horn in my lap as the snow climbed the walls. Endurance became my only skill. I learned to live on little food, to stitch old clothes into new, to mend leaks with rags. Each act was survival, but survival had no sweetness. It was a long, bitter endurance, and through it all, the horn remained the one object that seemed to share the weight of my suffering. At times, I wondered if I had outlived myself, if perhaps I was nothing more than a shadow pacing the cabin, waiting for a death that refused to come. But then I would touch the horn, and the thought would pass. Its surface was warm when it should have been cold, alive when it should have been lifeless. I came to believe the horn remembered me, remembered him, remembered the vow he had carried into the mountains. In my solitude, I made it a covenant. I would not leave it, and it would not leave me. As the seventh winter deepened, my body ached with weakness. My fire dwindled, and frost crept across the walls like a spreading disease. Yet still, I held on. Still, I endured. I told myself that to last another day was victory, that to last another night was defiance against a world that wished to erase me. The horn gleamed smooth and dark in the firelight, and I thought of it as my only companion, my only proof that time had not yet defeated me. And then, one morning, I stepped outside and found tracks by the creek. They were deep, deliberate, unmistakable. They were not goat, nor deer, nor fox. Something larger had passed that way, something that moved on two legs. I stared at the prints until my breath turned to ice in the air, and I felt the horn grow heavier in my hands. Whoever had left those tracks was not a beast of the valley. Someone had come near my cabin. Someone had circled close. Some nights I swore the horn spoke. I never confessed this aloud, not even to myself in the clear light of morning. But when the fire sank low and the wind pressed against the cabin like a restless hand, I would lift the horn and swear that a vibration stirred within it. It was not music, not breath, not any sound that could be mistaken for the blast of a shepherd calling sheep. It was something smaller, stranger, like a whisper trapped in the hollow curve of bone. And in my solitude, that whisper began to shape itself into words. At first I dismissed it as hunger, exhaustion, or grief playing tricks on my ears. Loneliness makes phantoms of the ordinary. A creak in the wall becomes a voice. A gust of wind becomes a sigh. But the horn did not creak or sigh. It pulsed. It resonated. I would press it to my chest and feel the vibration as though the object were alive. At times, I thought I heard my husband's call, the long, steady note he used to gather the flock when dusk fell across the hills. That sound had once meant safety, order, and return. To hear its echo in the horn unsettled me more than any silence could. Dreams carried the whisper further. I dreamed of him standing at the ridge, horn pressed to his lips, his face turned toward me as if waiting for my answer. I dreamed of sheep flowing like shadows behind him, and I dreamed of the horn's note stretching into the sky, never fading. Sometimes I awoke with my hand already grasping the horn, my mouth pressed against it as though I too had been trying to summon a sound. The question grew louder with each passing night. Was I slipping into madness, or was the horn itself alive? The more I considered it, the less it felt like my possession, and the more it felt like its own being, a vessel of something larger than grief. Perhaps horns were not only tools of shepherds, but containers of memory, of voice, of breath. Perhaps each time my husband had blown into it, some part of his life had lodged inside, and if that were true, then perhaps the horn carried more than memory. Perhaps it carried him. The thought both burdened and sustained me. If the horn was truly alive with his voice, then it was not simply a relic but a promise. It was heavy in my arms, not with bone but with expectation. I came to fear what might happen if I failed to keep it safe, if I dropped it, or if it cracked. At times I imagined the sound trapped within would leak away, lost forever, leaving me with nothing but a dead husk of bone. Yet I could not part from it. The more I heard, the more I believed. The whispers grew sharper, clearer, shaping themselves into fragments of words I almost recognized. I would sit for hours in the dark, holding the horn to my ear as though it were a seashell carrying the sound of distant waves. Some nights I thought I heard my name breathed faintly through it. Other nights I thought I heard a command. By the time the snows began to thaw, my life had narrowed into this endless cycle. Endure the day, guard the horn, wait for the whisper. I no longer doubted that it was alive. What I doubted was whether I could endure the weight of its voice much longer. And then came the night when the creek itself carried the sound. The wind pushed down from the mountains, curling through the trees, and in that wind I heard a voice call my name. It was not inside the cabin. It was not inside my head. It came from beyond the creek, echoing across the ice, as clear as if someone had stood outside my door. I froze with the horn in my base, hands, heart hammering, breath shallow, listening to the voice roll through the night air. It was his voice, and it was calling me. I began to breathe again. I saw him. A black horse moved slowly across the creek, its hooves splashing through the half-melted current. Upon its back sat a rider whose face I could not see, hidden beneath the brim of a broad hat and the veil of steam rising from the thaw. For a moment, I thought he was a trick of the shifting light, some shadow cast by the returning Sunday. But as he drew closer, the weight of his presence pressed against me, real and undeniable. I had long imagined such a figure. In the deepest nights of winter, when the horn whispered and the silence grew unbearable, I conjured the image of someone who might come for it, an omen, a thief, perhaps even a messenger from beyond the grave. Yet to see him there, flesh and bone, crossing the waters that had so long separated me from the world, was more terrifying than any dream. The rider was faceless to me, his silhouette blurred by mist and reflection, his outline shifting as horse and man blended into one shape. He rode without hurry, without hesitation, as though he knew precisely where he was going. My heart pounded as I stood at the cabin's threshold, the ram horn pressed tight to my chest, a hunger I had buried for years. Hunger not for food but for answers rose like fire inside me. Who was he? Why had he come? And why, above all, did I feel certain that he had not come for me, but for what I held? Fear tangled with longing until I could hardly breathe. I wanted to call out, but no sound would leave my lips. The thawing wind stung my face, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and rushing water, as though the land itself had awakened to witness this moment. The rider reached the far bank and stopped. His horse pawed at the softened ground, and he raised his head just enough that I felt his gaze fall directly upon me. Still, I could not see his eyes. The silence between us stretched like a rope, pulling tighter with each heartbeat. I thought of omens, of spirits, of the stories whispered by old women of wanderers who carried messages from the dead. Every part of me screamed that this was no ordinary man, and yet his presence rooted me to the earth. Then his attention shifted. It was not me he studied, but the horn in my arms. His head tilted, almost reverent, almost curious, as though the object itself had summoned him across the waters. The longer he looked, the heavier the horn felt against my chest. I wanted to hide it, to turn away, but my fingers clung to it with desperate strength. When at last he spoke, the words were few, carried in a voice low and steady, yet they cut through me sharper than the cold wind. It waited, no more than that. 2 words, spoken as though they were both explanation and accusation. I staggered back a step, my body trembling. The horn burned hot in my hands, and for the first time, I felt as though I was holding not memory, not grief, but a secret that belonged to someone else. The rider remained still, silent, his horse snorting mist into the air. The creak, the thaw, the whispers I had heard in the horn, all of it seemed to have led to this moment. Yet I did not know whether to run inside and bolt the door or to step forward and demand the truth. I could not move. I could only stare as the stranger sat on his black horse, waiting, as though the next move belonged to me. The silence stretched until I thought it would break me, and then, in a voice softer but more piercing than before, he said, "It waited for you the whole way. It waited for you the whole way," he said, and in that instant I nearly dropped the horn. Those were not ordinary words. They were words I had once heard from my husband, spoken in the quiet hours after he returned from leading the flock. When he set the horn aside and pulled me close, he had said it once about me that I had waited for him at the hearth, that my presence was the anchor of his wandering. To hear them now, from the mouth of a faceless rider across the thawing creek, was like having the past torn open with a blade. I clutched the horn tighter, my hands slick with sweat, my throat closed, and for a long moment, I could not breathe. How could this stranger know those words? How could he reach into the private depths of a life no one else had shared? Suspicion and yearning wrestled inside me. One part of me wanted to believe this was a messenger carrying a fragment of my husband's spirit. Another part feared I was the victim of a cruel trick, a mad widow so desperate for hope that she would believe anything whispered to her in the wind. The rider did not move closer. He did not dismount. He simply sat astride his horse, steam rising around him, speaking in fragments that seemed carved from silence itself. When I tried to question him, my voice was raw, thin, trembling. "How do you know these words?" I asked. "Who are you?" But he offered no name, no explanation, only silence broken by the sound of the creek pushing free from its ice. Each moment stretched unbearably. He seemed neither friend nor foe, neither thief nor savior. His presence unsettled me, yet it also held me in place, as though I were standing in the current of a story larger than myself. I wanted to flee, to slam the door and hide in the shadows of my cabin. Yet another hunger burned within me, the hunger for meaning, for connection, for the possibility that my years of waiting had not been in vain. The horn weighed heavier with every heartbeat. My husband's memory swelled in my chest, colliding with the reality before me. Could it be that he had sent this man, or that some remnant of his vow had lived on through the object I carried? Or was this rider no more than a drifter who had learned the secret of a grieving woman and come to torment her? The rider finally shifted in his saddle, and his horse pawed the ground. He lifted his head once more, and though his eyes remained shadowed, I felt the pressure of his gaze pierce me. His words, when they came again, were as spare as before. It was never lost, only carried. I nearly fell to my knees. The meaning eluded me, yet the weight of the words crushed down upon me. I wanted to demand clarity, to seize his cloak and force him to speak plainly, but fear of what truth he might reveal held me back. Perhaps it was better not to know. Perhaps mystery was kinder than revelation. And then, in a voice gentler than the first, he asked, Will you let me stay, just for this night? The question struck me like a blow. A stranger at my door after 7 winters of silence. A man who spoke words no stranger should know. To allow him inside was to risk everything. The horn, my fragile hold on sanity, even the memory of my husband. Yet to refuse him might mean turning away from the answer I had waited years to hear. I felt the horn tremble in my grip as if it too awaited my reply, and with a dread that tasted almost like hope, I realized that letting the rider in might awaken more than I was prepared to face. That night by the fire, his tail unwound like smoke, coiling through the rafters and into the cracks of my small cabin, until I could not tell whether the creak in the timbers was the settling of wood or the weight of his words finding places to rest. He sat on the low bench near the hearth, cloak steaming as the thaw dripped from its hem, the brim of his hat set aside at last, though the light still drew shadows across his features in a way that kept him half a stranger. I brewed what mean drink I could offer and cradled the ram horn in my lap as if the bone might steady my hands, and when I told him to speak, he nodded once, like a man answering a summons he had long expected, and began. He told me he had no fixed home, that the line of his life threaded river to river, ridge to ridge, trading work for food, message for shelter, a small favor, here for a safe crossing there. He said there were places where water taught him patience, and places where the wind taught him to listen. And though at first I thought him the kind who polished a tale as a gambler polishes a coin, I heard something in the cadence that reminded me of the horn against my ribs, measured, resonant, unhurried, because it carried a purpose. He had met shepherds, vagrants, soldiers, and widows like me along the way, he said, and all of them gave him pieces of stories, which he carried until the weight of them forced him to find their rightful hands again. By the time he spoke of the high path where snow thinned to a glittering skin and avalanche scars ran like pale lightning across the slope, my breath had fallen into rhythm with his, and the night outside felt less like a darkness and more like a listening. He did not give me my husband's name at once, and I did not ask. Instead, he described a narrow shelf of rock and the kind of treachery that hides in bright weather, when the sun loosens the mountain's grip just enough to promise safe passage, and how a man with a flock can mistake the glitter of it for mercy. He spoke of a horn call he had heard from a distance, a low, steady note, the kind that gathers strays, and how he had known by the steadiness that the one sounding it was both practiced and patient. He was above the pass when the white slashed down, and though he rode hard to reach the cut where the trail disappeared, he found only a churn of snow and shattered ice and a silence that had already closed its mouth over the cry that followed. In that hush, he said, something in him refused to leave the story unfinished. He searched the drift with the blunt tools of his hands, digging until his fingers burned, and the only thing the mountain surrendered was the horn, half buried, its mouth packed with snow as if the last breath blown through it had frozen there. He did what travelers do when they find an object that is more than an object. He made himself a caretaker. He slung it by its cord, and in the months that followed, the horn swung against his side as he rode valley to valley, asking at cook fires and way stations whether anyone knew the name of the man who used to call sheep with a tone so sure it could gather trembling animals at dusk. It was a long time before anyone directed him to a valley where a woman had stopped speaking to people but not to a piece of bone. When he said this, I kept my eyes on the fire because I could not bear to meet his look. He sipped the bitter drink, and the glow threw back the weariness beneath his skin, the kind of weariness that is not from lack of sleep but from carrying something delicate for too long. I realized then that if I had endured 7 winters of waiting, he had endured 7 seasons of bearing. My loneliness had been a still, suffocating room. His had been a road that did not allow him to set the burden down. If I was a keeper of silence, he was a keeper of motion, and both of us had been thinned by the work. He spoke then of a notion I had never put words to, that there are messengers and there are carriers of vows, and though they sometimes look the same, they are not. A messenger delivers words and leaves. A carrier bears what cannot be spoken, a ring that closes a promise, a letter that must be burned unread, a horn that holds the shape of breath. He told me he had carried many things across waters and through storms, but the horn had changed him more than the others, not because of its weight, but because of the peculiar sense that he was not walking ahead of it or behind it so much as beside it, the two of them companions in a task neither fully understood. I felt a tremor in the bone as if his speaking had woken something within it, and I asked him, with the calm of a person who has run out of stratagems, why the horn had not been given to any of the shepherds he passed, why it had not found its way to another flock, another mouth. He said he had tried once to hand it to a man whose hands were competent and kind, a herder on a middle ridge who might have honored it, but the moment the horn left his fingers, he felt a wrongness like a misstep in the dark, and the other man felt it too because his face had tightened, and he had given it back without remark. After that, the rider stopped trying to rid himself of it. He accepted that some objects do not accept chance homes. They travel as if pulled by an unseen thread, and the best a man can do is keep pace until the thread brings him to the door that answers its tension. There were parts of his account that slid past detail into suggestion, as if he feared to say too much would mar the truth with explanation. He admitted he did not know if the horn's pull was real or if he had imagined it out of guilt for arriving too late at the avalanche's edge. But in either case, the result had been the same. The road had narrowed to a single direction, and every river he forded led, eventually, toward me. He did not ask my forgiveness for delivering a relic in place of a living man, and he did not take credit for perseverance. He only described a commitment that had outlasted weather, distance, and coin, a commitment that had become, by the end, less like a choice and more like the continuance of breath. We sat in the hush that follows a story, that subtle interval when meaning lands softly and looks around the room to see where it can settle. I thought of my years of waiting, of the way grief had stripped me down until only the promise of the horn remained, and I saw how our lonelinesses had been two mirrored panes, reflecting each other from different sides of the same absence. If I had been a widow of winters, he had been a wanderer of seasons. If I had polished the horn smooth with keeping, he had polished himself down with carrying. In the glass of his fatigue, I saw my own, and in the steadiness of his voice, I heard the kind of restraint a man uses when he has learned that pressing a meaning too hard will crack it. He asked nothing of me except to listen. He did not touch the horn, though his eyes kept finding it, and when I shifted my grip or moved it closer to the fire to warm, I felt the attention in him flicker like a returning swallow recognizing its eve. He told me there were men who believed that horns like this were vessels, and there were others who called such talk superstition, and in the wide spaces between those beliefs he had learned to walk without declaring either camp his home. What mattered, he said, was not whether the bone was enchanted, but whether the vow it represented kept two lives from drifting into meaninglessness. Hearing that, I realized with a cold certainty that I had not been guarding an object. I had been keeping a course. The fire sank lower. Softened into shadow, I felt the old weariness rise, the ache of a body that has slept too little and a heart that has held too much, but beneath it ran a thin quickening, the kind that comes when a life that has been frozen for too long starts, against your will, to thaw. I asked him if, in his carrying, he had ever been pursued by something he could not name, and his gaze slid to the shutter as if he had already been watching the place where night presses hardest. He said quietly that roads draw more than travelers. They draw eyes, and sometimes hands, and sometimes the kind of hunger that has forgotten what it truly wants. I thought of the prints by the creek that were not goat or deer, and my fingers tightened on the horn until the ridge cut into my palm. He leaned forward then, the fire sketching a tired geometry across his cheekbones, and for the first time he let the roughness in his voice show like a frayed edge in cloth. He told me the trail he had taken down from the high ridge to my valley had not been solitary, that the sense of being matched in pace had grown on him in the last days, that when he watered his horse at dusk, the water's surface sometimes shivered in a way that did not come from wind. He did not claim to have seen a face, only a presence that stepped where he had stepped and paused where he had paused, a patience that spoke of either discipline or obsession. When the last log settled and sent up a light scream of sap, he finally named the thing without giving it a shape. He said he was not alone on the trail. He said someone had followed, and then he fell quiet, as if the telling of it had delivered the follower to our threshold. The rider's eyes lifted to the door with a calm that made the hairs on my arms rise, and in the hush between us I felt the night outside lean closer, listening, as if the thing that had matched his steps in the high country had found our fire at last. I thought grief had taught me fear, that after 7 winters of listening for hoofbeats that never came, and whispering into a horn that sometimes hummed back, there could be no further edge for dread to cut in me. I had been a companion to darkness and a student of silence. What threat could outstrip the slow blade of absence? But when he said he had not been alone on the trail, the old kind of fear returned in a form I recognized from girlhood, when danger was not a fog inside the mind but a figure outside the door. It was astonishing how quickly the body remembered. The breath shortened, the ear tuned, the skin learned again to read the intentions of night. We banked the fire lower and sat without speaking, letting the crackle soften until the room's sounds grew distinct. The tick of cooling iron, the small sigh of the pine wall, the faint hiss where thaw seeped from the rider's cloak and met the heat in the hearthstone. He had the stillness of someone who had hidden in worse places than this, and would do it again if the story required. I, who had spent years imprisoned by my own quiet, found that I could not abide a fresh silence that had purpose. I rose, set the horn on the table with care that felt like devotion, and moved to the shutter. The air slipped through the seam and touched my cheek fever cold. I peered out at a world remade by thaw and moonlight. At first there was only the creek loosening its grip on ice, a skein of pale water glimmering as it tested its banks. Then, as my eyes adjusted, I saw the darker darkness at the edge where the alders leaned, a human height of shadow not moving and therefore too deliberate to be a trick. The quiet in our cabin was fragile as a glass bell. One alarm would shatter it and ring for miles. I set my hand flat on the shutter and kept the figure inside my sight line long enough to be certain it was real. The rider stepped without sound to stand beside me, and though he did not touch the wood, I felt the shudder, steady, as if his nearness had given it spine. This was the moment when I realized my isolation had been broken, not just by an arrival, but by a pursuit. I had spent years believing that if anything came for me, it would be memory or mercy. The shape by the creek promised neither. We watched it together, and the longer we looked, the more the scale of its patience revealed itself. An animal tests a scent, shifts weight, snorts, leaves. A thief calculates angles, then acts. This one seemed to be taking a measure that had nothing to do with walls or windows. It felt like the tall arithmetic of covetousness, a weighing of what the horn might be and what it might fetch, not in coin, The rider's breath feathered my hair, close enough that I could hear the small catch it made when the shadow leaned forward and a slick gleam at its waist caught the moon. Not a blade. Even in that thin light I could tell the line of metal was not meant for cutting but for prying. A tool, perhaps a hook or a forging bar meant to pry boards up silently and lift latches from afar. The practicality of it chilled me more than a weapon would have. A knife is a declaration. A tool is an intention. I went back to the table and gathered the horn into my arms as if I were lifting a sleeping child. Its curve settled into the accustomed notch of me, and for the first time since the rider had come, I understood with an unflinching clarity why the follower waited instead of rushing. The horn was not simply valuable. It was the center of a story, and anyone who had followed that story this far would want not only the object, but the certainty of the object's meaning. Theft in such a case is not mere taking. It is the erasure of someone else's vow so that a new vow, ambition, legend, trade can be written over the old like a palimpsest. The thought struck in me a defensive heat I had not felt since the day they told me the mountain had kept my husband and would keep him forever. I had not been able to wrest him back, but this piece of him I could defend. The rider did not ask for the horn. He did not even look at it, though the tension in his jaw changed when I held it. He spoke in a field hand whisper, telling me the plan as if we were shepherd and dog mapping a dusk movement. Bank the fire to shadow, leave one lamp burning behind the bed, set the horn where it would seem carelessly placed, and settle to rest as if we were two people overcome by the day and the drink. He would take the corner near the latch with a length of cord, and I would keep my hand on the horn while pretending to sleep. If the follower was cautious, we would hear the test at the shutter. If bold, we would hear the latch. We did as he said. Everything in me bucked at the play acting. My solitude had made me honest to the point of bluntness, but I lay back and let the horn rest above my ribs while my palm covered its ridges. The lamp threw a pale coin of light up the wall, and the rider made himself into a smudge beneath it. Cord looped in fingers that looked too steady to be mortal. I listened to the creak count its thaw. In that counting, my mind discovered a different arithmetic. How many nights I had stood alone, how many times I had wished for help and feared it in the same breath, how many names I had refused to say to keep from summoning a grief too large for my body. The horn pulsed once beneath my hand, or perhaps it was only my pulse, but the effect was the same. I felt connected to something that observed us as we observed the door. The test came as the rider had said it would, in a seam of sound rather than a clatter, a small flexing of wood that would fail to wake any but those waiting for it. The latch probed as a blind worm might seek the mouth of earth, precise, patient, shameless in its insistence. I kept my breathing even. The rider's cord made no sound at all. Only his shoulder lifted slightly, then fell. The motion of a man priming a snare that has caught many animals but never quite this species. I thought of the first winter when I mistook wind for hoofbeats, and I felt the humiliation of that error wash away beneath a new competence. I knew the difference now. I could name the threat this time, and naming is the beginning of mastery. I would like to say that caution kept the follower at the threshold, that some old superstition held his hand at the door. But hunger can be more devout than tradition. The latch eased, the door slipped, the cold entered as a creature on its own four limbs. The figure who crossed the sill was taller than I had expected and narrower, an economy of flesh carved by travel and purpose. No mask, no bravado, only a face made expressionless by the long practice of being where one should not be. He did not look at me at first. He looked at the table where the horn had rested earlier, then at the hook by the hearth where a cord might hang, then at the bed to count shapes. When his gaze found the horn on my chest, there was no disappointment that I had not hidden it better. There was only the kind of recognition that told me he had already mapped this possibility and accepted the work it would require. The rider moved with the suddenness of unexpected mercy, a loop cast to catch a wrist at the moment it reached. But the follower was smoother still, as if all his joints had been oiled by anticipation. He slipped the cord, turned with a grace that suggested he had never in his life met a straight line he could not curve, and sidestepped into the lamp's pale coin as if asking to be seen for the span of a heartbeat. In that instant I noticed the scar that crossed his lower lip and the notch taken from his left ear, mementos of trades badly made or warnings ignored. I did not need more than that glance to know that the horn was not his first pursuit and would not be his last. He withdrew without touching me, retreat swift and silent, and the door closed behind him with the soft respect of a burglar who prides himself on leaving rooms as tidy as he found them. We held still for a long minute, letting the air settle, counting to a number that felt safe and then past it to a number that felt certain. When we finally moved, it was to check the bar on the back window, the seam at the shutter, the rope of the loft, and to bank the fire so low it would not betray us to eyes peering through chinks. Exhaustion took me by ambush after the vigilance broke. My body, which had been all wire a moment before, became a bag of wet grain. The rider told me to rest, that he would keep the watch until the gray of dawn made every shape honest, and I obeyed because I had learned in one night what I had not learned in 7 years, that sometimes you must let another carry your fear for a while the way he carried your vow. I lay down with the horn where it always lay, the mouth turned toward my shoulder, my palm over the ridge that I had worn smooth as river stone. Sleep, which had been a stranger for so long, came like a patient relative, and I greeted it without ceremony. I woke to a cold space against my ribs where warmth should have been, to a weight gone that I had believed could not leave my grasp without tearing skin. The bed was the same. The lamp's circle had died. The rider's shape was a darker shadow by the window, but the horn, which had been pressed between my body and the blanket as if welded there, was not beside me. I did not make a sound. I reached, found only cloth, and in the place where bone should have rested, there was the faintest hint of damp, as if something had been lifted with a carefulness that respected what it stole. I sat up into the dark that had not yet decided to become morning, my hand closing on air where the horn had slept for 7 winters, and the room answered with a silence so complete that I knew the follower had taken more than an object. He had taken the only steady voice left to me. The ram horn was gone, and with it, the last of my husband. I knew it before my eyes were fully open, knew it from the cold pressed into the hollow above my ribs where the curve had rested for 7 winters. Knew it from the weight that did not answer my reaching hand. Grief has many languages. That morning it spoke as absence. I sat up and touched the blanket and found only the faint dark print where bone had warmed the cloth, and for a moment I could not remember how to form breath, as if my lungs had learned to move only under the horn's small burden and now refused their work without it. I did not cry out. Sound would have made it real. I only pressed my fingers to the empty place and felt the knife slide of realization pass cleanly through me. When the cry finally did come, it tore the room open. The rider turned from the window, where he had been keeping the last hour of watch, and in his face I saw that he had already guessed what I had not yet dared to say. The door was still barred, the shutter still latched. No board had been pried, no hinge loosened. The thief had known our inward shape better than we did, and he had shaped himself to it with the delicacy of a glove. Rage rose in me so quickly I was frightened of the creature it made. It was not the scream of a woman robbed of an heirloom. It was the sound of a vow torn from the body that had kept it, a noise that wanted to ruin anything in reach for daring to stand when the one thing that mattered had fallen. "I will have it back," I said. and my voice, when it came, was calmer than the storm beneath it, the calm that sometimes follows a breaking because there is nothing left to shatter. The rider did not answer with comfort, which I would have hated, or with blame, which I could not have borne. He answered with motion. In a handful of heartbeats he was dragging on his cloak, buckling the girth, pressing his palm to the floor where the thief's boots must have stood. He told me to dress for snow and water, for pursuit that does not stop, for food. And I obeyed, because the body knows how to follow when the mind is ablaze. We stepped into a morning that had not yet decided to be day. The creek wore a thin sheen of melt. A pale fog lifted from it, like breath. The rider crouched and found what I could not, the faintest indent at the sill, the whisper of a print on the packed path where my own steps had erased all but intention, the ghost of a scuff at the bank as if a man had paused to test the ice with the toe of his boot. Those signs seemed like miracles to me, but to him they were a sentence he could read, and when he mounted, he reached down his arm. I took his hand without ceremony, swung onto the horse behind him, and leaned into a posture I had not held in years, my body remembering the old skill of riding behind another, trusting his balance, adding my eyes to his. The cabin receded at our backs like a page you cannot afford to reread. We tracked the thief along the creek, where willow roots knitted the bank into a lattice of shadow, and the water found voice again in small, urgent tongues. Every sign was slight, and every slight sign felt like reprieve. A pressed blade of grass where the frost had been broken, a shallow heel mark in a seam of thaw, the rub of a shoulder against alder bark where a man had squeezed through too tight a place. Anger and fear made a bitter mix in my throat. It was strange to discover how much power an object can have when it is gone, how quickly the mind converts memory into weapon and points it at itself. I saw my husband's hands polishing the horn, and I wanted to punish myself for sleeping, for trusting, for wishing just once to be held by rest. The rider must have felt the tremor in me because he spoke only to the work before us, not to guilt, not to fate, naming landmarks, naming choices, letting the practical rhythm of pursuit carry us where thinking would only drown. The forest closed around us, a cathedral built by years of weather and growth, the kind of place where a small sound carries and a large sound reveals more than it warns. We moved through fern and pine and the cold spice of thawed needles. I read the rider's body as I would a hillside in winter, how his shoulders tightened when sign grew thin, how they loosened when a line returned, how his right hand hovered near the reins when he felt the need to halt without noise. I found that I had more uses than grief had allowed. I slid from the horse when the ground softened, testing the seep and the hold, finding the safe edge of a half-rotted log. I moved ahead on foot where the track pinched, calling the rider forward with a hand when the way was clear. Rage, when given a task, can become precision. Past noon, the sky paled as if lit from behind by a lantern set too far to warm. We came upon a place where the creek split, one branch cutting toward a cutbank streaked with last year's swallow nests, the other snaking into low country where marsh grass lay combed by old wind. The rider rested his palm on the earth as if reading a friend's fever, then let out a breath that sounded like satisfaction. He took the high branch, he said. He does not trust the marsh. I understood the choice without needing it explained. The high branch meant firmer ground but fewer places to hide, faster going but clearer sign. It meant a man who believed more in distance than in cover, either confident or pressed. We pressed too. The path steepened. Patches of snow still lay in cups between roots where sunlight had not yet reached. My breath plumed, and the ache in my legs became a clean fire that burned away useless thought. Twice we crossed the water by stones that tested our balance. Once the rider lifted me as if I were no heavier than a coat and set me on the safer rock, and I let him without shame. The horn had not been simply stolen. It had been taken from its rightful keeping, and that wrongness whistled through my bones like cold. I spoke to it in my mind, as I had for years aloud. Hold fast, hold shape, hold breath. If ever an object could hear, this one could. Toward evening we found proof that felt like a voice. The thief had paused where the creek cinched between boulders, and his boot had slipped on a shelf of ice, leaving a smear where the grit in his heel bit and skated. The rider crouched and traced the little arc. Tired, he murmured, and something inside me soothed at the thought. Tired things make mistakes. Mistakes can be followed. We drank from the creek, water so cold it seemed to strike sparks in the throat, and ate what the rider had tucked into his saddlebag, which was little but tasted like more because it was forward motion made edible. Dusk came with the kind of soft red that looks like mercy from far away and like blood when you stand inside it. The forest thinned, and the creek widened into a long, pale ribbon where the current ran beneath a skin of new ice. At the far end of that ribbon, something caught the last light and flashed dully before going dark again. I felt it before I knew it, felt it the way you feel your name spoken across a crowd. We left the horse tied to a bent spruce and moved low along the bank, making the shapes that deer make when they distrust the open. The wind had dropped. The world held its breath. It was a small mound near the bend where the water turned back on itself, a hard shape beneath fresh snow where everything else lay smooth. The rider knelt first, brushing with his gloves, then with his bare hand when patience overcame prudence. I dropped beside him and pushed the snow aside with both palms, heedless of the numbing burn. Bone gleamed. Cord showed. The ram horn lay half buried as if someone had pressed it quickly into the drift and fled. A guilty ritual performed by a thief who had lost nerve or gained some wiser fear. For a moment the sight of it was so vast that I could not see the detail. I only wanted to lift it and press it home, to fill the hollow it had left, to believe that nothing had changed except my faith in the world. I reached. "Wait," the rider said, and his voice made a boundary around the act of touching. He shifted the snow more carefully, uncovering the mouth, the curve, the tip. He slid his fingers along the ridge as a doctor might trace a bone to know where it has given way. His breath shortened. I knew before he spoke, because some part of my hand recognized the difference between perfect smoothness and a wrong line, between a history in the bone and a wound. The horn was cracked, a hairline at first, then a split that widened barely enough to take the edge of a fingernail, running from the mouth's rim along the curve where my husband's thumbs had once worn the surface to a sheen. It was not a shatter. It was a promise of shatter. Cold had found a seam and worried it open. I did not scream this time. I did not weep. I put both hands beneath the horn and lifted it the way a mother lifts a child who has fallen, and smiles so the child can borrow a steadiness she does not feel. Inside me, the panic was a white moth beating against glass. "We have it," I said, as if saying the words could scold the world back into obedience. "We have it, and it will mend." The rider did not answer at once. He studied the split with the concentrated grief of a craftsman who knows exactly what his skill can fix and exactly what it cannot. He touched the crack at the rim and brought his finger away with a thin fleck of whitened dust, and the look on his face told me something I had not let myself think, that a crack in this bone might be more dangerous than the theft itself. Night settled with the quickness of early spring. The cold came down like a decision. We wrapped the horn in the rider's cloak, and I pressed it to my body for warmth as if my heat could close what the freeze had opened. We turned for the cabin with a speed that had confession in it, and the creek kept pace, whispering like a messenger who has not yet chosen whether to bring comfort or doom. Halfway home, under a sky hard with stars, I felt the horn shiver in my arms, and a thin sound rose from the cracked mouth, half breath, half wound, that told me what the rider's silence had already said. Something inside had been damaged, and it would not wait quietly for morning. The horn was broken, and so was I. I had thought my heart had emptied itself of new ways to hurt, but there is a peculiar pain that comes when the vessel that has carried your grief cracks, as if the grief itself might leak out and leave you with nothing, not even sorrow to explain your days. Back in the cabin, we laid the horn on the table as carefully as one sets a body for washing. The crack ran like a pale river down the curve, not wide, not yet, but purposeful, the kind of line that nature draws when it intends to continue. I held my breath the way you hold it at a bedside when a sleeping child turns and you fear to wake what sleep is mending. The rider fetched the small tools he kept rolled in oiled cloth needles, waxed thread, the kind of all a man carries who repairs his own world as he goes. He did not touch the crack with metal. Instead, he warmed beeswax in a tin and softened a length of leather thong in water. He spoke not to me but to the task, words like a litany to steady his hands. I watched the care of it and felt a scene open within me. My husband at this same table, paring a splinter from a lamb's hoof, setting his mouth in the line it took when he focused on saving small lives. The memory was sharp enough to draw blood. I pressed my palm to the table to stay in this room and not fall backward into the one that no longer existed. We cannot seal it shut by force, the rider said at last. We must keep it from widening, keep it warm, keep it carried. He looked at me then, and the steadiness in his eyes made room for what he said next. Hear me. This is not only memory. There is a vow in this bone. I wanted to reject the sentence, not because it startled me, but because it answered too cleanly the thing I had only let myself half believe. A vow, I said, not as a question. He nodded and placed the warmed leather as a gentle brace along the curve, binding it with a patience that made prayer unnecessary. He told me what he had learned on roads where stories travel faster than men. That horn is not merely a trumpet for sound, but a vessel for breath. And breath is the closest thing the body has to soul. Shepherds say this as metaphor. Messengers say it as instruction. There are people he had met them who seal words into objects, not to imprison them, but to keep them from thinning in wind and rain. A last promise, blown into horn with intention, can endure like a coal banked beneath ash. That is why, he said, some objects refuse to be misplaced. They are carried by the vows inside them as much as by the hands outside them. It is why he could not rid himself of the horn on the ridge, and why I could not bury it even when my neighbors called me mad. The thing had been given a task. So had we. I touched the leather he had wrapped, and felt a shyness I had not felt since girlhood, as if I were intruding on a conversation between breath and bone. What vow? I asked, and the room changed shape around the question. He did not answer at once. He spoke, instead, of the lore that warms travelers at borders, stories of horns blown at city gates to close a promise between households, of horns hung above doors to keep a pledge from wandering, of a horn buried with a commander, so the oath to defend the pass would not thin as the stones forgot. I had heard scraps of such tales and dismissed them as the kind of embroidery people add to hold their own lives together. But as he spoke, the horn gave a faint answering hum, and the hair along my arms bristled as if a familiar had entered the room. Your husband, the rider said softly, was a man who finished what he began. He took the flock high late that year to cut the graze before the storms, not only for coin but because he had promised the lambs would return fat. He promised you other things too, I imagine. He glanced up, as if measuring how far to walk into my life. On that ridge, when the slope loosened, he blew a note that was not only for sheep. It was a promise turned outward. I heard it from the far pass. I think he sealed what he could not carry down into this horn, and so it traveled. Anger flared because love does that when it is cornered. He promised me a life, I said. He promised me years. The rider accepted the blow like a man who knew he deserved a part of it. He promised, and all I received was an object. My hand went to the crack as if to accuse it, and the horn trembled under my touch. I withdrew, shocked at my own cruelty toward the thing that had kept me. He did not contradict my fury. He folded it carefully into the work. A vow is not a trade, he said. It is a tether. Sometimes it binds two people. Sometimes it binds a person to a task. If the horn had broken clean on the mountain, perhaps the promise would have scattered with the snow and left you free to forget. It did not. It found us. That means there is something yet uncarried. We kept it warm by the hearth and kept ourselves awake with the thin soup of late winter. The rider told more of the mythic practice as the hours moved, of horns filled with words and then sealed with wax by a hand that had learned to steady in storms, of the way such vessels can grow dangerous if cracked, because a promise half kept and half broken can wound anyone who touches it. A whole vow will guide you, he said. A broken one will cut. I turned this over as I watched the crack, expecting at any moment to see it grin wider. The horn looked smaller than it had, and at the same time larger, like a map you suddenly realize includes lands you have stood upon, without knowing their names. What happens if it breaks fully? I asked. There it was, the pit at the base of the path. We could no longer pretend we were not walking. The rider's hands stilled, and he looked toward the shutter the way a man looks toward weather he cannot bargain with. The cabin felt very small then, a box holding a coal we could not let die and could not afford to fan too bright. He told me what he believed, and perhaps he only believed it because belief is the bridge that takes a person from ignorance to duty. But the certainty in him steadied me more than doubt ever had. He said the vow inside had kept its shape by the narrowest mercy, that the crack did not only threaten the horn, but the integrity of whatever promise lived there. He said that when vows burst, they scatter their demand in sharp pieces. Those pieces lodge in lives at random and torment them with a longing for something they cannot name. He said he had seen villages undone by broken oaths more than by storms. He spoke as if the horn were a small dam holding back a flood of meaning that would drown indiscriminately if loosed. We worked until night thinned to embers and embers to ash. I slept in a chair, the horn wrapped and warming against my chest. And in that uneasy rest I dreamed I walked a ridge with my husband while sheep moved like cloud at our knees. He said nothing. He only placed the horn in my hands again and again, and each time it grew heavier, until I woke sweating with the sense that if I did not move soon, something would move me. Dawn came sharp and blue. The crack had not widened. The leather held. For a few blessed breaths, I believed we had snatched the vow back from the edge and set it upright like a pitcher that has sloshed but not spilled. The illusion lasted until I lifted the horn and felt a minute shift in it, like water behind a wall that has begun to seep. The rider saw the change in my face and did not ask. He only gathered his things and slung his cloak as if tightening a sentence around his shoulders. We cannot stay. Whatever this horn was meant to do, it is time to bring it to the place where it can do it, or break trying. I did not ask where that place was. I think I already knew. The ridge, the pass, the place where the avalanche had cut our lives. Fear rose, but it did not paralyze. It organized me. I banked the hearth, wrapped bread, filled a skin, and tied my hair with the old strip of wool I had used on lambing nights. The horn felt both fragile and sovereign in my arms, as if it could command me to strength while begging for mercy. I spoke to it as if to a companion. Not yet, not yet. Hold. We stepped into morning with the kind of resolve that can look like peace from far away. The creek ran faster. The thaw had sharpened. The rider set a pace that neither hurried nor lagged, a pilgrim's stride that wastes nothing. Each turn of the path unrolled a memory, the first winter's hunger, the third winter's retreat from neighbors, the fifth winter's near madness, all of it collapsing behind us like roads you burn only after you cross them. I felt a fierce tenderness for the woman who had kept the horn all those years. I wanted to tell her that her waiting had been a kind of travel after all. We paused once beneath a fir whose lower boughs made a dry tent, and there, with the sky a clean slice between needles, I asked the question I had been circling. If the horn breaks fully, what then? The rider did not soften it for me. He met the crack with the truth it demanded. If the horn breaks fully, he said, so will the vow. My husband's last promise was not to me but through me. I felt that truth before the rider spoke it aloud, as we climbed toward the pass where the avalanche had ripped our life in two. The horn lay wrapped against my chest, braced in leather, warm from my body, trembling now and then with a faint inner pressure like a baby's kick against a mother's palm. The morning was knife bright. The creek beside the trail ran hard with thaw, shouldering ice, muttering as if annoyed by its own speed. I had walked these slopes as a wife who waited. Now I walked as something else, a bearer, a hinge, the person a promise had chosen to pass through. The rider warned me the path would grow narrow, and the snow treacherous where it held the memory of winter beneath the crust. He spoke steadily, a metronome for fear. When we reached the first scar of the old slide, he stopped and set his hand to the earth the way he had at the creek, like a man listening through his fingers. This is where the note changed, he said, eyes on the cut. I heard a call that was not for sheep. The statement felt like someone opening a shutter on a room I thought I knew. My husband had blown the horn to gather his flock countless times. I had loved him for the order he could pull from distance. But on that day he had done something I had never witnessed. He had turned the horn outward, past animals and hills, into the wide where messages become vows. We pressed on. I asked what message a man could entrust to a traveler he did not know. The rider's answer was an embarrassment of honesty. He said he had not known my husband in the way neighbors know each other, but he had recognized a certain discipline in the sound. The way the note held unwavering, the way it did not plead. A vow does not beg, he said. It binds. He had found the horn half buried and without reason he could defend, had taken it as charge rather than salvage. In the first village he had asked for a name, in the second for a widow. Someone remembered a flock on our ridge and a woman who had turned silent. Word does its own walking when winter is long. The horn chose the road. He kept pace. I wanted to despise this logic because it bypassed consent. It meant my life had been pulled along unseen by a promise I had not made, a task assigned at the edge of another's breath. It meant my husband's last intimacy with me was not a farewell but an instruction. The betrayal stung precisely because duty began to make sense. Rage rose. Why him? Why not me? Why carry a sound to a stranger instead of a final word to my ear? But even as fury flared, another knowledge unfurled in its heat. He had known how stubbornly I keep what I am given. He had known I would hold. He had known that through me a thing might endure. We paused where the slope tilted toward the old path and the creek curled in close, white-rimmed and fast. The rider told me what some road priests teach, and what old women mutter when they bind straw over lambing pens. Horn holds breath, with a fidelity wood cannot. A final exhalation shaped into tone can keep its contour in the bones chamber, not as music, but as pressure, as pattern, as intention. He believed my husband had poured a promise into this horn with the last clean breath before the slide, and that promise had sought me the way water seeks level. "It is not for me to open," he said, looking at my hands. "It is for you to carry to where it can open without breaking." "What is the vow?" I asked, because a bearer is not yet a believer until she knows the cargo. He did not answer with words at first. He took me to a shelf of rock where the valley lay unrolled like a blank sheet, and he pointed. The lambing corrals, the lower meadows browned by winter hunger, the broken fence the neighbors had promised to mend and never had, the cabins whose chimneys smoked thin because flour was low. "Not a romantic vow," he said gently. "A working one. I think he promised provision. I think he vowed the flock would return, and if he could not walk the sheep down, he would send the power to gather." I felt insulted by the practicality even as I was moved by it. I had wanted a vow that said my name. Instead, I heard a vow that held my people together. The insult was my grief speaking. The movement was my love, learning a larger shape. I argued with the dead because anger needs a target. I told my husband in my head that he owed me a promise about our table, our bed, our years. The horn warmed further, as if embarrassed to be a witness to smallness. Then I thought of the valley's hungry faces and knew that a vow which gathers a scattered flock gathers me too, because I am one of the scattered. To accept that was not surrender. It was consent. Cloud gathered while we stood, the kind that grows from the edges and pretends it is not conspiring until it suddenly island. The air cooled. The rider lifted his face and measured the wind with the inner instrument that has kept wanderers from ruin since men first chose trails. "We must move," he said. "The creek will rise." We skirted the next scar. Patches of old crust gave underfoot with the treachery of flimsy bridges. I held the horn close, felt the minute shiver inside it grow more insistent, as if something waited for a threshold we had not yet reached. I began to believe the vow recognized its place better than I ever could. At the mouth of the pass, the creek tightened to a shining rope and screamed in its throat the way water does when it is forced too thin. Snow started to fall, wet flakes that strike like thrown cloth, and then multiply until the air itself is cloth and you are the needle that cannot find a hole. Wind took the flakes and gave them speed. In the whiteout the slope lost edge. The world became indistinct except for sound and the pressure of the horn in my arms. "Here!" the rider shouted, but the word blew backward. He reached for me and caught my sleeve as my boots skated on a rim of ice. The horn knocked against my ribs. A tiny crackle answered inside like ice breaking in a cup. We did not see the flood begin. We felt it. A tremor traveled up through stone, a shift of tone in the creek's complaint, a sudden insistence as if a door had opened upstream and old water remembered its job. The rider dragged me toward higher ground, but the path had narrowed to a choice between slick rock and a bank already rotting. The snow fattened. The wind tore it sideways. The creek climbed its own edges with frightening speed, brown under the white, loud with sticks and ice. I tucked the horn under my cloak and pressed it into my stomach the way a woman shields a child. The rider wrapped his arm around me and moved as if his body could be a wall. Then the bank gave. The bite was small, just a square of earth torn loose, and then the square unmoored another, and the edge where we stood slipped an inch. Then two. I fell to my knees and slid. The rider caught me, but the motion spilled the horn from my grasp to my lap and then from my lap to the snow. I lunged. My fingers met smooth bone and slid with the treacherous grace of meltwater. The horn rolled, slow at first, then decisive, as if drawn. I snatched again and caught only air. The creek rose to take it. The horn struck the lip, bounced once like a living thing startled by cold, and vanished into the brown rush. Borne instantly around the bend where the current tightened, I screamed a sound I had not known my throat could make, and the wind tore it into ribbon. The rider leapt after, landing in the shallows with the authority of a man who has run out of cautions, but the water seized his legs and shoved. I followed because there was nothing else left to be. The last thing I saw before the white closed was the horn turning in a pocket of calmer flow, mouth up, as if gasping. Then the river took it, and the vow I had carried moved beyond my control. The storm thickened, the creek roared into river, and down in that blind, brown throat, the horn went from sight. I stumbled after, certain that if I did not catch it now, something in me would split along the same line and never mend. I waded into the flood, chasing the horn as if my soul were inside it. The water was snow-cold and muscular, a body made of many bodies, shouldering me sideways. Before I had taken 3 steps, the bank pitched underfoot. Stones rolled like loose knuckles. I kept my eyes on the line where the current sheared around a boulder and frothed there. The horn might hesitate. There a hand might change fate. I thought nothing elegant. My mind was a single command: forward. The river punished forward with a shove that took my knees. I went under, mouth full of melt, ears slammed by noise. The whole world narrowed to brown brightness and the barbed pull of cold along bone. A hand cabled my collar and hauled me up. The rider's face was a sheet of gray, his eyes bright with a kind of patient anger reserved for fools and kin. "Keep to the inside," he said, and then he lost his footing and went down so hard the sound of it traveled through me like a bell. I grabbed his sleeve. He gripped my wrist. We became a small, stubborn machine, each a lever for the other, inching from rock to rock, while the river tried to remake us into the simple shape of drift. In the gaps between waves I scanned for a gleam of bone and saw only wreckage, splinters of branch, a drowned tuft of last year's grass, a shard of ice spinning like a coin flipped by a giant's thumb. We reached a bar of gravel that threw up a hiss where the current hit it. The rider shoved me onto it and crawled beside me, coughing, then sat up with the single-minded economy of a man who has no time for his own suffering. "Downstream bend," he said. "If it rides the inner curve, it may strand." He pointed where the valley opened its jaw, and the river swept left around a low, thorny spit. Between white tongues I saw a brief, improbable glimmer, a rounded surface wet enough to shine. The sight struck me like a thrown stone. I ran. The spit was a rack of roots and mud, snow crust breaking under my boots with the discouraging sound of paper tearing. Water hammered around it, eager to erase its defiance. I slid along the inner edge, palms out for balance, boots filling, calves burning. The rider came behind, half wading, half swimming, shouldering his way through swifter lanes. The horn bobbed into view again, kissing the eddy line, rolled by the river's palm as if considered for release, and then refused. I lunged with a branch. The branch skittered and struck emptiness. The horn spun, mouth up, took on a little water, tipped, righted, drifted just beyond the length of my arm. A sound left me that embarrassed me even as I made it a child's plea dressed in a widow's throat. We left the spit for a shelf of ice that cantilevered over deep water. The rider warned me off with a cuff of his voice. I did not listen. Love makes engineers of us. We test loads the structure will not bear. The ice sang its thin, suicidal song and cracked in neat arithmetic. I sprawled, arms wide, tried to become surface. The horn passed beneath, an oval shadow moving like a slow fish. I beat the ice with my fist and watched the shadow accelerate the way living things do when threatened. The rider slid on his belly, grabbed my belt, dragged me backward as the shelf failed where my weight had argued with it. Cold water surged up my sleeves and took my breath and punishing clarity with it. We retreated to mud and scrub. The horn reappeared in rougher water, knocked end over end like a toy in a child's temper. Despair rose with a sick tin taste. If it shattered, the vow would splinter. If it escaped, the vow would wander. If I surrendered, I would become a room with no furniture, a story with its middle torn out. Enough, the rider said, but he spoke to the river, not to me. He waded into a chute that would have humbled a bull and set himself sideways to it. Legs braced, shoulders square, a wall built of stubbornness and anatomy. The river hit him. He held. He did not look heroic. He looked employed. Now, he said, and his voice was a plank flung across panic. The horn came, rolling like a moon broken loose from a tired sky. It struck his thigh and ricocheted into the slack behind him where his body broke the flow. He stamped, creating a pocket, and for a heartbeat, the horn hung there. Indecisive, I went in up to the chest, teeth cracking, arms numb with cold, and reached. The current tried to fold me into itself. The rider reached too, and in that brief geometry his brace, my reach. The horn's pause, the world allowed a small theft from chaos. My fingers closed on smooth bone. The river pulled. The rider's hand caught my elbow, and the joint lit with pain like a flare. Together we levered backward onto the gravel bar where the stones shifted as if delighted to betray us. We sprawled, filthy, shivering, ridiculous, holy. I cradled the horn. The crack had lengthened by a hair's insult, a thread of pale along the dark sheen, but the leather brace still held. Water poured from the mouth and ran down my wrists like a brief private waterfall. I set my ear to the rim. Inside, a pressure thrummed like a trapped heart. I sat up, terrified by the strength of my desire to open it now. Here, with river stench in my nose and blood beating at my temples. The rider's hand landed lightly on mine, the gentlest touch he had ever given me. "Not here," he said. "Not like this." His lips were blue. The skin along his cheek was abraded where the river had argued with the bank and used his face as proof. We staggered along the inner curve where the ground offered cooperation. The sky tore itself into rags. The storm that had been snow higher up was rain here, mean and insistent. Behind the hill, a low animal bellow rolled thunder or earth complaining. I could not tell. The horn grew heavier as if the water inside multiplied rather than drained. Perhaps promises drink when frightened. The thought should have made me laugh. It made me walk faster. The rider stumbled. I caught his sleeve. He set his jaw and shook me off with a gratitude that did not want to become debt. We made the high bank, just as the river leapt for it. From there I could see our whole chase laid out like a child's drawing: spit, shelf, bar, bend, and a second drawing beneath it, the one the river had been sketching of us. 2 figures tiny against flood, one dark, one pale, a bone between them. I set the horn on the grass for a breath and knelt over it the way a nun kneels over a relic when she has forgotten the words and hopes posture will do. The rider sank to his heels and pressed his fist against his chest as if arguing privately with his heart. That was when the horn sounded. It was not breath. It was not wind. It was not the accidental note a child finds when he plays at trumpet. The sound rose from the horn as a pressure that turned to tone as it touched air. Low at first, then steady. A line so clean I felt my old life split along it like cloth under a sharp blade. The tone did not come from me or from the rider. It came from the vow inside the bone, reaching its limit and choosing to announce itself rather than die in silence. The note ran out across the brown water, crossed to the far bank, climbed the scarp, touched the stands of pine, and kept going until even the storm seemed to step aside to let it pass. It was my husband's pitch, truer than memory, unfaded by years. The valley answered, not with voices, not yet, but with motion, a stirring in the lower meadow where ewes had drifted into hunger-stupid scatter, a shifting on the ridge where the neighbors' boys had taken the flock too early and lost half to bramble, a turning of heads toward a sound older than their understanding. The rider looked at me as if witnessing a law revealed. I looked at the horn and saw a future I had not earned, rolling toward me like weather. The note faltered once, caught on the hairline crack, then steadied, as if the vow had found a way to pour around damage the way water finds the long path when a stone bars the short. I reached to lift it or hush it, I do not know which, only that the human fear of being seen unmade me, and the horn rang a fraction louder, as if to rebuke intervention. I held my hands above it, afraid to touch, and afraid to let it sound, while across the valley sheep began to move like a cloud pushed by an invisible wind, and the horn kept singing on its own, calling everything that had scattered me most of all. When the horn sounded, it was not my voice, nor the rider's, it was his. The note came from the bone itself, a clean line cutting through storm and distance, unmistakable in pitch, as though my husband had only stepped behind a ridge and blown to call me home. My body answered before my mind could, knees softening, breath catching, arms opening as if to embrace the air. For years I had begged the horn to speak, pressed it to my chest until bruises bloomed, dreamed of whispers only I could hear, and now, with no lips on its rim, it spoke back in his voice, and the world rearranged itself to listen. The rider knelt beside it, not in awe but in recognition, like a man present at the end of a long task. He did not touch it. He only bowed his head as the tone stretched, steady as dawn, and crossed the valley. I felt the sound enter me, not through my ears but through my ribs, as though it sought the hollow where grief had nested and filled it with something larger. Grief had made a cage of me. The sound split the bars and let the waiting escape. It was not release as I had once imagined, soft, merciful, tear-washed. It was fierce, overwhelming, a rupture that left me gasping. Below, the flock gathered, from scattered ridges, from half-forgotten corrals, from the edges of hunger and neglect. Sheep moved as if pulled by thread. I saw them swarm the lower meadow in a shape that reminded me of cloud, or smoke, or a congregation pulled toward prayer. Neighbors stepped out of cabins and lifted their faces, mouths open, not in fear but in wonder. They had not heard his call in 7 years, yet their bodies remembered. Even the children who had never known him stilled, sensing a sound older than their lifetimes. I pressed my hand to my chest, where absence had lived so long it had become organ. The note changed it. The absence remained, but it was no longer wound. It was witness. My husband had not returned in body, but his vow had. He had promised provision, promised gathering, promised endurance, and the horn delivered that promise beyond his grave. My waiting had not been madness. It had been participation. I was no longer only widow. I was keeper of completion. The rider spoke softly, words nearly lost under the sound. It has finished. I turned to him, desperate for instruction, but his gaze was already far, following the line of the note beyond where we could see. He looked like a man released from bondage, yet weary from carrying chains so long. He met my eyes and said, "Your husband trusted you, and the horn found its way because you would not lay it down." I wanted to ask what it meant for me now, who I was when the vow was fulfilled. For 7 winters my identity had been wrapped around the horn's silence. If the silence had ended, what remained of me? But before I could shape the question, the horn itself answered. The note softened, faltered once as though acknowledging the crack in its side, then steadied again into a gentler tone, less command than benediction. It was not for sheep this time. It was for me. A farewell without words. A release spoken in vibration. My body understood. You may live now. The sound faded with the rain, until storm and vow were indistinguishable, both dissolving into the valley's wide ear. The rider placed his hand briefly over mine where it still guarded the horn, a touch that carried neither ownership nor demand. It is not empty, he said. No vessel that has carried a vow ever island, but it is finished with you. That night we sheltered in the cabin, horn set gently on the table like a guest who has exhausted himself telling his story. I dreamed, not of avalanches or hoofbeats, but of plain ground, green and unremarkable, where my husband walked ahead with staff in hand and did not look back. When I woke, I wept, not the frantic weeping of loss, but the clean kind, a rain that leaves air brighter. The rider did not watch me weep. He packed his gear in silence, rolled his tools, tightened his saddle. At dawn, he stood in the doorway with his hat pulled low. There are other roads, he said simply, other burdens. You do not need me here. I wanted to argue, to keep him as proof that the last days had been real, but I understood. His gift had never been companionship. It had been carrying, and carriers do not linger where the vow is done. He mounted his black horse, crossed the creek, now calmed from its frenzy, and without looking back, rode into the thaw. The cabin was mine again. The silence returned, but it was changed. Less cage, more canvas. I set the horn on the mantel where the fire's warmth could hold it. It no longer throbbed with pressure. It sat as bone sits, still and watchful. Yet I knew better than to call it mute. It had spoken once without mouth or hand, and it could speak again, not for me, but for someone whose vow had yet to find shape. I went about my days with a steadiness I had not known in years. I mended fences, traded wool, shared bread without bitterness. The neighbors looked at me differently, some with suspicion, some with awe, but I no longer needed their verdicts. I had lived inside a legend and survived its ending. That was enough. Evenings, I sat by the fire and polished the horn out of habit. Its crack remained, bound with leather, a scar that reminded me how close we had come to losing everything. When I traced that line, I did not feel panic. I felt kinship. I, too, had cracked under weight and kept shape anyway. The horn and I were no longer mourner and relic. We were witnesses of endurance. And yet, when the wind turned just right, slipping down from the ridge with the smell of thaw, I sometimes thought I heard a faint hum in the horn's hollow, not strong, not insistent, but present. It waited. Not for me I had been released, but for the next soul bound to a promise too large to bear alone. 7 winters had taught me to mistake silence for punishment. Now I knew it could also be preparation. The ram horn would wait as I once had, not for grief, but for the day another vow, desperate to endure, came seeking its hollow. And when it spoke again, somewhere, someday, someone else would know what I had learned, that love does not always return as we wish, but it returns as it must, through endurance, through voice, through the carrying on of a promise.